The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want, we got to organize.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Pantsula Podcast, brought to you by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. For those of you who are not familiar with the A-APRP, we were actually founded in 1968 by the first president of Ghana, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. And for those of you who are also not familiar with our objective, we are seeking for a totally unified and socialist Africa, totally liberated, unified and socialist Africa. This is the way we describe Pan-Africanism. Today, we're going to be talking about AFRICOM versus U.S. democracy, or AFRICOM and U.S. democracy, I should say. But before we get started, before each episode, we like to commemorate two of our ancestors. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to my comrade Winfred, who's going to go ahead and outline our two ancestors who are commemorating this episode too.
So our first ancestor is Queen Mother Mary. She was one of the leaders of the 1878 Fireburn Labor Riot, or uprising, on the island of St. Croix in the Danish West Indies. She was born Mary Thomas in 1848 in Antigua and moved to St. Croix to work in the plantations. So for some background, so after Africans were emancipated from slavery in the Danish West Indies in 1848, labor laws were changed to stop plantation workers from bargaining for better wages and work conditions. So when Africans tried to leave these plantations, the government made it more difficult and more expensive to leave the country, in a way to try to force the African workers from staying on the plantation. And they were ignored workers' attempts to negotiate better working conditions. So this sparked the 1878 Fireborn Labor Uprising, of which Mary Thomas was one of the leaders. And because of her role as one of the leaders, she began to be known as Queen Mary, a name which she remained after her passing in 1905. Our next ancestor is Obi Egbuna, born in Ozubulu in Anambra State in Nigeria in 1938. He studied at the University of Iowa and Howard University, and later moved to London in 1961. As a member of the Committee of African Organizations, he helped organize Malcolm X's visit to Britain, and he was also a novelist and a playwright, working with the Pan-African Players, the Caribbean Artist Movement, and the Negro Theater Workshop. He also became a pioneer of the Black Power movement in Britain, creating the Universal Colored People's Association as the first avowed Black Power group in Britain, and spoke against the exploitation of Black workers across the world and against the Vietnam War. As a result of Britain's Race Relations Act of 1965, he was imprisoned. But later on, after his imprisonment, he continued to write and returned to Washington, D.C., where he stayed until his passing in 2014.
All right. Thank you, Comrade Winfred. So as I stated earlier, this episode is on AFRICOM and U.S. democracy. So I will go ahead and start off with just explaining AFRICOM, what it is, and then we're going to dive into some questions and, have an open dialogue. But essentially, AFRICOM is a imperialist institution, which is founded by the U.S. It's actually, AFRICOM stands for the United States African Command Center. Essentially, it was authorized in 2006 under the Bush administration, and then wasn't officially active until sometime in October 2008 under the, yes, you guessed it, the Barack Obama administration as well. The sole purpose, or one of the main purposes of AFRICOM, is to train a lot of the African militaries, air forces, as well as intelligence services in service for imperialism, U.S. imperialism, essentially. So one of the first questions I guess I would ask is, or kind of maybe even dive deeper into, is what does AFRICOM really serve, and what is the main interest of AFRICOM? So we kind of open the floor for that, and we could kind of dive into essentially what that means.
So As we know, we can trust every U.S. government website. So if we go to AFRICOM's own website, www.africom.mil, they state what their mission is. So it says U.S. Africa Command with partners. This is a quote: counters transnational threats and malign actors, strengthens security forces, and responds to crises in order to advance U.S. national interests and promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. So if we try to break that down, it's saying that the Africa Command works with different partners, whether they be countries or organizations or governments or whatever, to counter threats and malign actors to whatever the U.S. sees, whatever AFRICOM, so the U.S. military command, sees as a threat or a maligned actor. Strengthens the security forces of the forces that they believe to be legitimate, and responds to what they see to be crises. And it says that they say themselves that all of this is in order to advance U.S. national interests and promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. So if the main goal of the U.S. Africa Command is to advance U.S. national interests, then it means that everything that they do is to advance the interests of the United States. For a government and for a country that relies on the resources of other countries, it means that the national interest would be to maintain the stability of the countries that they're extracting resources from.
Kind of just to further everything you said is, it's all about, as I was stating earlier, it's a imperialist institution. So the whole purpose is to maintain imperialism, right? And to ensure that they are able to extract the resources and control the land of these various places for multinational corporations or transnational corporations, right? So when we talk about that and controlling resources, we know that that is the primary motivator or factor in all of our societies. And it's been like that since the beginning of mankind. It's taking things like cobalt, coltan, gold, whatever, right? And processing it or remanufacturing it and distributing it, right, to the advance. Now, in this case, under capitalism or imperialism, is to advance a minute amount of people, right, in relation to like lining their pockets. Yes, we know we consume it in the imperial core, but the country that those resources come from, they don't see the benefit of that, right? Most of these places, when you talk about Africa, if you talk about AFRICOM, a lot of people, for the most part, can't afford a lot of the things that we consume on a day-to-day in the imperialist countries, and that is solely because imperialism is purposefully subjugating that said nation. The way imperialism and capitalism works is that you need one country to be exploited at a higher rate or higher level than the imperial core, so you'd be able to get more of a profit. Hence why things like AFRICOM is in place, right? It's to be able to have children working mines and fields and whatever, right? And anything that could become a threat to that, any organized front that could actually happen, they want to be able to train the African police forces or military forces to be able to know how to suppress that in that case. So they need to ensure that that does not happen, because organized revolution is a primary threat to U.S. interests, U.S. imperialist interests, or capitalism, U.S. capitalist interests too as well. So it's all combined essentially. And I think because we're seeing, right now with the alliances going on around the world, given the contradictions of U.S. imperialism, it's on its way out the door, on top of the fact of what's been going on in Africa with the various uprisings, against French powers, or, even in various other places throughout Africa as well. We're starting to see the sway in the world's balance in relation to, but we know it's a struggle, it's a constant struggle. AFRICOM is just going to stop, or U.S. imperialism is just going to, give way and okay, here you go. They're going to constantly still try to suppress, repress exploit Africans, murder Africans no matter where they are. Even what we're seeing in Haiti too, what they're doing, trying to resist U.S. intervention as well. So yeah, so I guess that would lead me right into my second question, or the second question, which is, what are some like misnomers and fallacies about the U.S. claim to spread democracy around the world via imperialist institutions like AFRICOM?
So the first thing to point out is that they work with countries regardless of whether or not it's a dictatorship or not. So with AFRICOM, they partner with whoever is in government, whoever they feel like is beneficial to recognize as in government, whether it's a dictatorship or whether it's a representative democracy or whatever form of government that exists. So just at that basic level. So if there is a claim that AFRICOM is meant to spread democracy, uh, them working with and strengthening the power of dictators works immediately against that notion.
Yeah, exactly. Like the whole notion of them saying they're spreading democracy is, a euphemism for imperialism or imperialist interests, right? Or spreading imperialist interests. They're not really there to save that said country at all. We haven't seen that. Like, when they did what they did in various places in the African diaspora or even on the continent, we have never seen them advance the material interests of the people, right? If anything, it's gone backwards whenever they intervene. When you look at what's going on in Sudan and the balkanization that took place there in South Sudan, when you look at Libya, right, under Gaddafi, it's funny because AFRICOM had a direct a hand in destabilizing Libya as well. On top of that, so anywhere you think of, even now with Haiti, they're talking about going into Haiti. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to stop the gangs and whatever, right? Like, they're going to repress the people who are fighting against the tyrannical regime, right? That's been ran by the U.S. So yeah, there's never been a time or instance where, at least for Africans, African people, that the U.S. has came and helped with democracy. Someone could even say, oh, what about Liberia? Liberia has been one of the first neo-colonies on the African continent. You look at Firestone and all the implications of things that's been going on there in the time, exploitation of labor and the resources of rubber to make the Firestone tires. There's so much evidence that shows on this, right? And then just think about all the bases they have on the continent as well. So because they want to maintain their interests as well. So yeah, there's never been a time where, once again, that they have ever cared about African lives. If anything, they are complicit in African death, African suffering, all day, every day. It's not a time where they're not involved in that. So you would be hard pressed to find a time where they actually did spread quote unquote democracy. And democracy isn't spread. You can't export revolution. You can't export these things. These things are led by people. They run and dictate, and create these conditions themselves to create a democracy. If they're not under a current democracy, they overthrow it. When we look at Ghana, we look at Algeria, FLN, you look at PDG in Guinea, and you look at so forth and so on, and you look at the current state of what's going on now, as stated earlier, in different parts of the African world, people are fighting and resisting and struggling to create a democracy because they're tired of not being able to feed themselves, feed their families. Their material conditions are backwards, right? Because of imperialism and imperialist interests who are going in the country and implementing these neo-colonial puppets to run their country to service imperialism. So yeah, that's that whole notion. I think if you really believe that when the US says they're going to invade Haiti, they're going to invade Sudan, they're going to invade Somalia. They going to invade X country in Africa. Just know that like what came out. Even though this is primarily focused on Africa, right? We're also internationalists. As Pan-African, if you're a Pan-Africanist or revolutionary Pan-Africanist, you should be internationalist. So when we look at what happened in Iraq, and I know that's a lot of people know, what went on with the, weapons of mass destruction, quote unquote, right? And that whole Islamophobia run, and you could really argue it's still going on now, that was taking place at that time. You come to find out when they invaded there, they destabilized Iraq. Over 1 million people ended up dead. Infrastructure still needs to be rebuilt and things of that nature. So it's like, what was this democracy or quote unquote threat that they had that we need to come to restore order? And really all we did was just leave it in destitute. Same thing with Libya, right? Oh, Gaddafi was this tyrannical leader who, authoritarian, quote unquote, who was running the country like a madman. And, they had his army take Viagra and doing all this crazy stuff that they were claiming that has no basis, that's been debunked, right? And then, when Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa, the highest quality of living in Africa, Gaddafi and the Jamaria were looking to create African-based currency backed by gold, right? What the AFRICOM and NATO do? Invaded, and because they said they wanted to help create and foment democracy. And what do we see now, right? Currently there, we see destitute and destabilization and, slave trafficking and all these other things that were running rampant, and that wasn't taking place when the Jamaria were in power. Right. So I think we need to carefully evaluate these things and not just take what imperialism is trying to tell us, because as we understand is that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and they will push their narrative on us. So it's incumbent upon us to engage in political education, join an organization to understand these nuances, understand these things. And just like how my comrade Winfred did, these things, they don't hide. Go to Africa, go to AFRICOM, go to NATO site, go to their sites and read what they're saying. They don't really hide this stuff, They may throw like a little sprinkle on it, but it's not really that hidden. You can still read between the lines at the end of the day.
So even on their website, for the actions that they've at least advertised, they said that they built a school library in Djibouti, and that's building a library, expanding education is vital. But they just mentioned one library, where they're one library in Djibouti, but if the main thing is spreading education, why do you need the military to do it? Why is their budget $280 million in the year of 2022? What are they doing with that money? When even building the school library was a 4-week program. The AFRICOM has been in existence actively for over a decade. What else do they have to show? And in a famous quote, who have they saved?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think it can't really be answered. And it's like, you can contrast that with, I'm gonna say the bad word that a lot of people to China. You contrast that with, revisionism. Oh my God, they're revisionist. And if eradicating poverty and increasing the standard life expectancy and just quality of life overall in China is revisionism, then hey, we need more of that in this world, because what's going on in this capitalist imperialist state is, man, it's backwards. So so when you compare and contrast that with the win-win cooperation strategy of China, we see the amount of highways, railroads, schools, and while not having nowhere, they don't even have a real military base. And one could argue, Djibouti, the same place you were talking about, is where their quote unquote military base is, and that's solely purposeful to protect their naval ships that they have in that area, to trade and barter with that part of the world. So yeah, it fails in comparison. Like they don't engage in, backing coups to overthrow democratically elected presidents, or anything of that nature at all. Like their whole thing since the non-alignment movement, or the Bandung Conference, is, non-interference in internal affairs anywhere, whether it's in Africa or anywhere around the world. So they purposely do not do that, right? We give resources and they build infrastructure. And the way it works and the way imperialism works now with U.S. imperialism, the trade is you do what we say and we just stabilize you. And we take your resources and, you get this debt. And that's very much what the exchange is. If you don't pay this back, there's going to be implications to this, right? The political implications to it as well. Where we've seen China forgave loans in various places like Libya and others as well. And I'm talking millions upon millions of debts, in terms of amount in different various countries in Africa. So I think that it's not even a comparison when people want to talk about this whole fear mongering of China is coming. Oh God, look at this. It's just aiding to imperialism at the end of the day. I guess one more thing I would ask is, what will it take, or what can we see or envision how AFRICOM demise will come about, or how we could take it down? What will it take for us to take down AFRICOM?
It would take international unity. So with AFRICOM, it's a program that exists in a variety of countries within Africa. And so with it, if one individual country says that, I'm not going to work with AFRICOM, or I'm just going to deny them, AFRICOM will just work with a neighboring country. So now, regardless of what happens, AFRICOM can have a military base close by in a neighboring country, and we're back to square one. So it needs to be every country possible being able to work together and say, no, we don't want AFRICOM here. And then when there are pushbacks or workings against African countries because they want to deny U.S. military presence or U.S. military bases on their own land, there will have to be other countries that offer support, that offer alternatives if there are sanctions put down on that country, or if there are any economic or political forces put against that country that does deny AFRICOM's presence.
Pretty much to add to what you're saying, is it's definitely going to take the organized masses, the organized African masses, on top of, the international community too, helping and aiding externally. But we also got to make sure that Africans are organized themselves. And, back to to the international part, I do look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine because anyone who thoroughly has been evaluating the scenario, the current state of that war, especially the historical precedents to that war as well, is that this war isn't really against just Ukraine, right? That Russia is fighting. They're fighting a war against NATO. And AFRICOM is an offshoot of NATO, essentially, right? The same interests, the same people are behind the crafting of AFRICOM. When you talk about NATO. So I think that is interrelated. What's going on today with U.S. and China, U.S. is trying to provoke against China, and China, seeking to defend itself against the U.S. and accelerate its development as it gains power, and even the alliance of BRICS. All that is, going to work in our favor because, in my opinion, it's all weakening NATO, right? Because we see the internal contradictions heighten amongst even the own NATO states, right? Which is directly correlated, in my opinion, to the AFRICOM too. So I think we have to understand that, but not just solely rely on the external contradictions of AFRICOM and NATO, but also look at the internal ones as well and understand that Africans have to lead the struggle against AFRICOM on the ground, and as has been showing and as has been looking as of recent, Africans are uprising. We just need the organized masses to lead that. All of our organizations have to be in coordination, and we need to build an all African revolutionary arm. So all these things is what Nkrumah called for in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. As I stated in our intro, that is the guidelines for the APRP, the building of the ACPC, the All African Coordinating Political Committee, All African Committee for Political Coordination, and then the All African People's Revolutionary Army as well. So that's what it's going to take. It's going to take us being organized, building a revolutionary army as well. And I think, there's nothing that the organized masses cannot do. And it's been historically proven all around the world as well. When the people are organized, aimed at the correct objectives, they have not been able to fail. So
one last thing I'd want to add is, so when you look at the amount of budget that they've been allocated since its inception, it's been allocated very literally billions of US dollars. And so the US Department of Defense is heavily invested into AFRICOM. So then the question becomes, why are they invested? What national interest do they have where they're willing to give billions of dollars to something? Is it really just to build one school in Djibouti, or is it for something bigger than that?
I always say that, to be a socialist it requires a lot of self-introspection, always guessing and not guessing, but always questioning everything around you, and also yourself. So when we look at these type of things as being stated by an imperialist institution like AFRICOM, it's the same way during the colonialism, they'll build one school in a country in Africa and try to make it seem like they did some big humanitarian cause when they they have political control and they're exploiting Africans relentlessly and, to their death. We're overworking them, and the working conditions are deplorable. Infrastructure is bad, and literally you have like one school throughout a whole country where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people live as well. So, and it's the same thing. They harp on one thing that they're doing, but when we look at the dialectics of things and weigh the positive and negatives, it's like the negatives overwhelmingly overpower the positive attributes of that said institution. So we should always ask ourselves, what is what does this really mean? Because imperialism overall is not a good thing, or doesn't mean a good thing for the people living in the said country that's being subjugated, or annexed, right? So
also make sure to check out the A-APRP website, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to other different channels and YouTube pages. So we have the Kaji Circle A-APRP YouTube page, the Forward Ever podcast on Spotify, the A-APRP YouTube page, which is A-APRP INTL, the A-APRP Southwest chapter, and then Revolutionary African Women's YouTube page, and our Ancestors Voices YouTube page as well. And we'll post all the links to that in the description.
Yeah, and then also I like to just plug in, we actually just got some new merch for our Forward Ever shop. So if you're looking for some new stuff, especially as the winter comes around, hit us around the corner and you're just looking for Christmas gifts or whatever, we definitely implore you to look at the Forward Ever shop, not only just for gear and looking fly. Everyone wants to look fly, I know, at some point, right? And rocking revolutionary slogans and whatnot, but you will actually be supporting the work that we do to help liberate and unify Africa. Another thing you can do to support that effort and us working to our objective is by supporting our comrades in Burkina Faso who have a political education center that they're trying to maintain. We will have the link also in the description as well for those who are looking to support that too. So with that said, we appreciate y'all for listening in to another episode of the Pantsula Podcast, and catch y'all on the next episode for whatever.
Or whatever.